Hi everyone, Ross here. Welcome back to the channel. As promised, this is the follow-up to the previous video that I did, going over my custom chapter, the Spectral Wolves. This video is going to be concentrating entirely on the first company colours though. When I started the army and working out the scheme, I kind of really wanted to do something similar to how the Dark Angels have the Deathwing, and they have sort of different colours depending on the different companies. So it's quite a nice way of being able to have a different colour scheme to do as well for the same army. So if you've seen the previous video, you'll know that the other companies, so the second, third, fourth companies, will be entirely done in the blue colour with the white cream colour as the accent colour, and it's kind of reversed on this for the first company. And they also tend to be a little bit more ornate, a bit more gold, and I sort of reserve this colour scheme for things like the Terminators and the Blade Guard, things like that. Now obviously some ground has already been covered in the previous video for certain bits. Things like the purity seals, the eye lenses, stuff like that, they're done exactly the same way. I'll still kind of go with them, but maybe not in quite as much detail in this one. And at that point towards the end of the video, I'll sort of just maybe go over some of the background of the chapter as well. So as this colour scheme is reserved for the first company veterans, then what better ones to start and paint than the Stern Guard? Now I always start with a black primer, but obviously we're doing quite a light colour here, so you could always do it with a lighter grey. And then I'm using an airbrush to spray on Rakarth flesh. Again, if you don't have an airbrush and you can find a similar colour with a spray can, then obviously go with that, because painting this sort of colour on with a brush is not always the easiest. You would have to go over it quite a few times to get a nice smooth coat. But yeah, if you're aware of a spray that's exactly the same colour or very, very similar, then please let me know, because I'd be interested. I built up this colour really slowly with the airbrush, just one layer at a time, maybe 3 or 4 layers of the colour on each one. I'm not bothering with the zenithal or anything on these, it's just not the style that I'm going for with this look. It's just a solid coat all over. Now when I paint Space Marines, I like to do all of the armour in one hit, so the shading and all of the highlights before I start putting any of the other details on. If, however, you like to do things differently and maybe put all the base coats on, obviously you can change the order that you're doing things, but this is just how I go about doing things. Just because it just feels right to me to do this first and get all of the armour done, and then go back in and start working on the other details. So as a first step, I shade the armour. I go over the entire thing with a 50-50 mix of Rakarth flesh and contrast medium, and just basically pick out all of the recesses and all of those details on the armour. Part of the look for this army is trying to get it as neat and as tidy and as clean as I possibly can. So I'm very deliberate about where I'm putting this shade. And I also make sure that this goes on all of the weapon casings as well, because they're all done in the same colour. Now one thing that you could do would be to use a gloss varnish first and then put the wash on, and that will help to kind of bring the colours into the recesses without staining the armour. Can make things a little easier. You won't get things like that little mistake that I've done there. If you do get that, then just use a bit of water on a brush to kind of wick that away. I've not done a gloss varnish on this before doing the wash, because I want to try and keep this quite accessible, and I know that's an extra step that a lot of people do find quite daunting, especially if you're a beginner, so I've lifted that out. Thing is, as long as you're nice and slow and just take your time, you can do this quite tidily and get a nice clean result. And this is the result once all the shading is done. So next is to highlight the armour. I'm using Pallid Witch Flesh for this. Now I did mention this in the previous video that it's not the easiest paint to work with. It can be a little bit chalky, and yeah, it's not the greatest thing to use. But again, if you're quite slow and deliberate with it, it's usable. But a few people in the comments in the previous one gave me some ideas of some alternatives, so I'm going to buy a few and give them a go, and I'll pin them in the comments at some point if there's something I think is maybe a better fit. But for the time being, I'm stuck using it because I want to try and keep everything consistent across the army, so I'm not going to change anything just yet, so I'm going to stick with this colour. I've done quite a few of them up to this point, and it does work, but it's just not my favourite paint to use. So yeah, I'm just going to go around the entire thing, all of the armour, all of the edges, and just try and keep a nice, tidy, clean line across everything. And as part of the scheme, any of the sort of the details on the weapon casings, so those sort of any skulls, and you get some Imperial Aquillas and things like that, I paint them up in the same colour. So they're not done separately, they're kind of, they're done in the same cream colour and highlighted exactly the same and shaded the same way. I just really like the way it looks. It kind of makes the sort of the gun casings and things feel like one solid piece with those sort of decorations kind of carved into them almost. And yeah, this is the result once that first highlight is done. This actually armour is a hell of a lot quicker than doing the blue armour that the rest of the companies have done, because it only has 2 highlights rather than about 4 or 5. So the next colour I'll be using is just a pure white. I'm using Bold Titanium White from Pro Acryl because it's my favourite white paint to use, but any pure white that you have will do. And all I do with this is just to kind of do a dot highlight on the very most raised points. So the kind of the very kind of corner bits of the armour and the most raised areas of any kind of circular bits, so like on the knee pads, things like that. So it's really just a dot or just a kind of a line across maybe like where the neck is and things like that. And hopefully you can see that that final highlight on the armour just kind of helps to make it pop a little bit more. To be honest, it's not entirely essential. You could get away with just a single highlight, but I think this extra step, just adding that little bit of white on there, just helps to really finish it off and just allows that armour to kind of pop a little bit more. And this is the result once all of the armour is done. Already a big chunk of the work is actually already finished now, so which is kind of why I like to do all this step first rather than kind of building up the base coats and things. I feel like I've you know, sort of achieved quite a lot to start with, you know. It helps me to keep my motivation up. So the next step is to add the black areas. Now this is going to be mainly the knee pads and the areas in between the armour. But I'll also then go over and do a base coat of this over the areas that are going to be done in the silver metallics. So it's the rest of the gun, the chest aquila, and there's a few other little details on these that are done as well. So I use Black Legion contrast paint for this because it has a really nice matte finish and it just flows really easily as well. The areas that are going to stay black I'll go over twice, so they've got a nice solid colour, but the areas that are going to be done over the top with silver, or the silver metallics on the, say on the guns, will just get one coat to save time because they're going to get covered up anyway, so it doesn't really matter if it's a bit blotchy on those bits. And this is the result once all this is done. So hopefully you'll be able to see that it's just a nice step for this. It breaks up the armour a little bit, starts to add a little bit more detail, and you can now start to see the areas that are going to be done in the metallics and things as well. So next I'll then start base coating up the main sort of secondary colour, which is the sort of the blue, which is the main colour of the other companies. So this is more like adding a splash of this onto each one. So anything that's sort of like tilt shields like this, and mainly it's going to be the trim around the shoulder pads. So I start with a base coat of Incubi Darkness for this. It's thinned down quite heavily with water, and I'll maybe do 3 or 4 coats on this to keep it nice and smooth. And yeah, just very slowly build the colour up until it's a nice solid coat. So once I've got a nice flat base coat of that Incubi Darkness, I'll then highlight it up with Stegadon Scale Green. This is really just, again, around the shoulder pads and the exhaust bits on the power pack on the back, and obviously the tilt shield on this one as well. This is the first of a few different highlights I'm going to add to it to kind of build it up. Again, if you've seen the previous video, it's the same process again, but I'm going to go back over it again just in case you haven't seen that. Now there's one step that I did miss and didn't actually film, which was to add a bit of shade onto the blue areas. So as you can see, like the rivets there on the tilt shield and the recessed part on the shoulder pad, I just used a very thinned down Black Legion mixed with contrast medium for that. There's not too much of this, it's more kind of appropriate when you're doing the whole marine in that as the shade colour, but there are a few little bits here and there that need doing. So yeah, as you can see, just doing a really chunky highlight of that Stegadon Scale Green. It's not It's quite subtle, this colour, but it really does help to make that colour sort of pop a little bit more. Now for a second highlight, I'm then using Sotek Green, and this is more of a thin edge highlight. So I'm just going to go around all the edges of the armour that are done in the blue and just pick that out as a nice clean edge around all of that. And this is how he looks once that second highlight is done. Couple more to go though, unfortunately. The next highlight colour is Temple Guard Blue. I'm using this to kind of pick out any little rivets, and also just keeping this really to the very most raised corners on the armour. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody that subscribed to the channel recently. The previous video did really well, and it was a little bit, I wasn't quite expecting it to do as well as it had done. And yeah, we got quite a lot more subscribers, so thank you so much for joining me. I also just wanted to mention that we do have a membership for the channel as well. It's only £2 a month. It does a huge amount to support the channel and myself in helping me make more videos. And I'm looking to hopefully set up a Discord for that as well at some point relatively soon. So if you'd like to join and help support the channel, that'd be amazing. But if not, just being here and watching the videos is a huge amount of support for me anyway. So thank you so much. And as you can see, I'm just doing the final highlight on the blue here. This is using Baharoth blue, and this is really the same thing that I did with the white on the cream armor. It's just a dot highlight on the corners and the most raised parts of the sort of the curved edges as well. It's just a final highlight just to really bring that blue out, and this is my favorite bit of doing the blue. It's the final step, and it really makes it stand out, and I love the way that it looks when it's done. Now the next step is to paint in the tabard that's running down in between his legs here. So I'm starting out with a base coat of Steel Legion Drab, maybe doing 2 or 3 very thin coats of this just to slowly build that up and keep it nice and smooth. And once that's done, I'll then go back in with a mix of the Steel Legion Drab but with some black added and thinned down quite heavily with water. Not quite to a wash consistency, but just enough to kind of glaze that colour in. So I'm removing most of the paint on my brush and then just slowly adding that into the recesses to help shade it down. And then once that's dry, I'll then go back to the pure Steel Legion Drab and just tidy up a little bit, just to make sure that there's no kind of hard edges between the original colour and the areas with the wash on. The next step is then to highlight the cloth. Now to do this I use some Zandri dust, and I just use the brush to kind of make some flicking lines across and to add a sort of scratchy marks horizontally across all the raised areas of the cloth. And yeah, I slowly build this up over sort of adding more and more of the Zandri dust to the more raised areas, so less of those marks into the recesses, more onto the raised bits. And then once this is all done and all the highlights of this are added, it really does add to a kind of like a rough texture to the cloth areas, which I really like. It kind of it helps to kind of differentiate that material from the sort of the smooth armor. Again, if you have your own method to do this sort of thing, then obviously use that. But this is how I go about doing it, and I do like the way it looks. It's sort of, yeah, again, it just helps to show that this is a different material and help it stand out from the rest of the model. Once I'm happy with that, I'll then go back in and do the same thing, but using Ushabti bone. This time keeping only to the very most raised points to help add to that highlight on the cloth. And yeah, as you can see in the previous step, I also used the Zandri dust to base coat the paper areas of the purity seals at the same time as well, while I've got that same paint out. I had quite a few people asking me about the lore and the background of the chapter. I've not completely fleshed it out, but I've got a kind of a rough idea in my head of kind of how I see them and how I sort of think that they would go about doing things. So yeah, I mean, as a lot of these steps were already covered in the previous video, I'll kind of just maybe go over a little bit of that kind of while I'm painting here. So the first thing to say is that they are not in any way connected to the Space Wolves. I'm using the chapter symbol just because it was easy at the time. I started the army during the first lockdown, COVID lockdown in the UK, and I wasn't able to get hold of any other transfers. I kind of had it in my head I wanted to do something with the snake on it and maybe get some custom ones made, but in the end it never happened. And it was just easy to kind of repurpose the Space Wolf one because it's on all of the decal sheets you get with all the models, so it's always going to be easy to get hold of. So that's the first thing. They are not connected to the Space Wolves in any way. So how they work in my mind anyway is that the chapter itself was created shortly after the Horus Heresy by some very high up people within the Imperium that weren't happy with the direction that things were going in, and were able to kind of predict the future for the Imperium and seeing the oppression of the people within it and the rise of sort of superstition and religion. And the chapter was kind of put in place to not support the Imperium at all. It's there to kind of police it from the outside. So I sort of see their role as being protectors of the people within the Imperium rather than the Imperium as an organisation, if that makes sense. They're there to sort of protect humanity from itself. And that sort of plays into how I see them acting and fighting and everything as well. So they are very short on numbers. There's only 5 companies, the first company being the ones that I'm painting here in this video, and there'll be only maybe about 30 or 40 individuals for that entire company, and then 4 more companies, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th, and each of them is sort of structured a little bit more standard, like with maybe about 100 Marines in each one. And they don't have huge amounts of equipment. They don't have tons of tanks and heavy artillery and things. They are very limited how the equipment that they have, because they don't exist within the Imperium. So everything they have to take. So yeah, they're a little bit like a sort of a Robin Hood figure, that sort of thing, where they will steal things from other Space Marine chapters and equipment and ammunition and things like that, because that's not something that they can get hold of. They don't have. That's not provided for them. So yeah, because of their low numbers and their lack of equipment, I see them kind of acting in very small numbers. So maybe even just as individuals dropping into other battlefields and kind of acting in the background to kind of influence things towards their goals. So if an Imperial army is fighting something, maybe a very small team of these guys, or even just a single Marine will be dropped in to kind of help out in the background without anyone knowing that they were there. That is very, very much inspired by Solid Snake from the Metal Gear Solid series, if you've ever played those games. And yeah, I also quite like the idea of that sort of them acting in those very small teams, because it means that if you've already got a Space Marine army, and you want to just add a single unit of these guys, something like a squad of Eliminators or a lieutenant model or something along those lines, just to add into your Space Marine army, it would kind of work with their lore. There's just one guy who's turned up, or a very small team that are there to kind of help out without the others knowing that they've arrived. So yeah, I kind of see them as using sort of like guerrilla warfare tactics and sort of assassinations and things. So they're kind of destroying enemy fuel supplies and things in the background to kind of help influence the fight that's happening, or assassinating enemy commanders and stuff to kind of to help the force that they are supporting without anyone actually knowing that they are involved. So yeah, that's kind of how I see them anyway. It's not entirely fleshed out, and I'm not a lore expert or anything. I know the basics, but yeah, if you've got any ideas and want to kind of to help me sort of flesh things out and add some more to them, then stick it in the comments, and yeah, I'll kind of I'll helpfully sort of try and build on what I've got in my head at the moment. So, unfortunately, I didn't get any decent footage of me painting the metallic bits, but it's really just the areas around the guns and the chest aquila, and there's a few other little details here and there that I use. And yeah, at this point, I'm just going over the thin down wash of Black Templar and Contrast Medium mixed together. This is to kind of almost stain that those metallics with that sort of slightly black colour and give that sort of dark metallic look to them. Now, as obviously these are the first company, they're veterans, they've got a lot more sort of detail on them, and helping to kind of make them stand out even more so against the other companies. There's a lot more gold on these guys. So my method for painting gold for this would be to use Retributor armour, and then give an all-over coat of Reikland Flesh Shade, which is thinned down with some Contrast Medium again. You could use some water, but I just prefer Contrast Medium. I just like the way that it helps the paint to kind of pull into the recesses a little bit more. This is just my sort of method for doing gold, but again, if you've got your own, use that. I just quite like the way that this looks when it's done. And then as a final step, I'll just highlight up both the gold and the other sort of silver metallic areas using some Stormhost silver. Any really bright silver paint will do, but this is just the one that I use. And this is the final result, after a few decals and a spray with some matte varnish just to finish him off. Really happy with how he came out, and yeah, really genuinely love this scheme. I think these are my favourite models that I own. Anyway, I really hope this has been helpful, and I'm really hoping that somebody will paint a few of them and maybe tag me on Instagram. I'd love to see some other people's examples of them. So yeah, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all soon.